Hmm. And what is post-traumatic slave syndrome?
Well, this is the work of Joy Degree, and it's about, she explains that the ramifications of the trauma of slavery having been so absolute and so profound and debilitating, and it was sustained, a very important point that she makes, for over 300 years, plus all the post-slavery, Jim Crow and all the rest of it, that it continues reverberating emotionally and behaviorally, which is exactly how post-traumatic stress disorder works. You have a post-traumatic stress disorder, which means it continues to affect emotions and behavior. And the interesting thing is that captivity has been very well studied, so that Joyce Degree's work with post-traumatic slave syndrome, of course, dovetails with the work done on post-traumatic stress disorder, which has been studied by many, but Judith Herman, who studied captivity, like Elizabeth Smart, who was, held captive for years and then escaped and lived to tell her story, that in studying people who have been held captive, even for a short period of time or a year or whatever, the residual effect from the post-traumatic syndrome is shame, of all things, not fear. Shame is the residual impact of being held in captivity. And she describes someone who's held for a period of time as, each enslaved person, she writes, is in a permanently disordered shame status. So here they might be being raped and hit and abused and burned with cigarettes, whatever. Oh no, shame is the main thing that they are left with at the end, shame. So you can imagine the implications of this to people who endured 300 plus years of being enslaved in a most brutal way. So the reason we have the intensity of post-traumatic slave syndrome, according to Joy Degree, that we have has something to do with America's special brand of slavery.
Okay, so what is America's special brand of slavery?
Okay, so it's unique in all the world and in all the world history. It has to do with permanent slavery. So initially, when captives were brought to the country as it was being founded and the colonies, they came from all over. There were, all from all different European countries and Ireland and all over, and Africa, of course. And initially, everybody was indentured, 40 acres and a mule, but at some point it became expedient. The Irish could escape and blend in with the rest of people. There were certain disadvantages. The Native Americans kept dying from diseases they weren't immune to, but the African slaves, who were physiologically the most similar to the European settlers in terms of immunology, they're practically one continent with across the Suez Canal, and they had all the skills. They had the bricklaying and leather making and textile, all the skills that were needed. So it was decided, there's the slaves. That's it from here on in. Anybody who has evidence of African ancestry, meaning skin color, is now a permanent slave. Not like it usually is, where my people conquer your people and we take you as slaves. No, you're permanent slaves. So the economics of the plantation power structure created the myth, in order to have this work, of people from African descent being a separate race, a subhuman race, inferior. So that they began to manufacture a sort of a pseudo-scientific idea of separate races. So you can imagine the effort that it took for this to be pulled off in a country where all men are created equal. They had to make the people with African descent automatically slaves and say they're not equal. They're subhuman, so they don't count under that rule. And then not only were they slaves, their children were slaves, and the children of their children were slaves, just by virtue of their skin color. And then, came the one-drop rule, so that if you had any evidence of African ancestry, or any taint, as they said, of African ancestry, you were automatically labeled black, and you were a slave. So, white means no taint. It's the exclusion of all color, and black is just the taint. So if you have any of that, you're a slave. And this is what this color-based system, which created consciousness about skin color, so that if you have any, you're a slave. This led to what we have today, which is the black-white dichotomy.
Okay, so what do you mean by the black-white dichotomy?
Well, it's, a binary system, which belies the fact that we're really all one race, and we're just, on a genetic continuum. It belies that, because it makes it look like people are on either side of a biological divide. We are on either side of a social divide. But the dehumanizing designation of putting people in a separate color box and labeling them inferior and subhuman during slavery, it has created like a gouge in our society, like a trough. It has created a chasm, so that you have people on either side of that. And it creates the infrastructure that we use to organize all sorts of binary things, like it's using white as the standard, white versus people of color, white versus brown and black people. I hear all these different ways of saying it, white versus non-white people. But my question is, when do we get to question the word white? White is not a parallel construction. Once people of color, or people of African descent, began referring to themselves as African Americans, people labeled white should start referring to themselves as European Americans. Or once people started referring to themselves as Latino Americans, then the parallel construction to that would be Anglo Americans. But Anglo-Americans, all kinds of people speak English, so, that wouldn't work. We need a designation that shows this perfect pigmentation, this fetishism that we have about white. Those words, black and white, are so important because they sound like opposites. There's so much contrast. What is the most contrasting thing to put against white is black, and against black is white. As if we're just opposites. That's what the words imply.
Okay, so what is the meaning of black and white?
Well, in Western culture, not true in Eastern culture, but in Western culture, white is the color of purity and innocence and spotlessness and goodness, and it's the absence of any taint. White is the absence of color. So white is exclusive and excluding, and it's the perfect word for the ruling class to use to identify themselves, white. In Western culture also, black is the color of funerals. It's the color of death. It's the color of evil. The guy with the black hat in the cowboy movies is the one who brings the danger and the evil. It's the color of filth. It's the color of taint. So it was the perfect word for the ruling class to come up with to label people of African descent so that they could be oppressed. Black is the inclusion of all colors. We've come a long way, in terms of negative connotation of the color black. Black is beautiful, and we've come so far, really creating that much better way of viewing things. We still see people, though, in color boxes of black and white. So the post-traumatic impact of post-traumatic slave syndrome still lives on in our country.
And what are the symptoms of this post-traumatic slave syndrome?
Well, Joy Degree goes into this, and it's a fascinating study. They, of course, dovetail with the symptoms of any post-traumatic stress disorder, the universal symptoms. But if we kind of look at the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder of abandonment, and we kind of look at it from the point of view of people who descended from, from this tradition of slavery, we see a whole lot of stuff that's very interesting. The defining feature of post-traumatic stress disorder is shame. This toxic, traumatic shame that affects us from within secretly. And then we have the low self-esteem, the low sense of entitlement. We have lack of confidence, lots of self-doubt, self-hatred. We have insecurity in our relationships, those of us with post-traumatic stress disorder of abandonment. And we can be easily triggered into having that primal abandonment fear. There are self-defeating behaviors, like getting in our own way, self-destructive impulses, drugs, alcohol, that kind of thing. A lot of performance anxiety that prevents us from achieving.